Hello and welcome back to Psychology 303, the analysis of everyday behavior. Today we'll be talking about more about punishment, and in particular Chapter 6C that deals with making punishment effective. So let's talk a little bit about the factors that can affect punishment efficacy. There's a series of things that I want to talk about, and this is just a list. So we'll be talking about individual differences. We're going to talk about motivating operations. We're going to talk about immediacy and contingency effects on punishment, the relationship between continuous punishment versus intermittent punishment, and the magnitude of the punisher. So let's get started. This is a fairly short lecture, so let's get started. The first thing deals with individual differences, and I think it's important to remember that aversive stimuli, like reinforcers, like appetitive stimuli, are a matter of individual taste or individual interpretation. Just like reinforcers and appetitive stimuli have to be defined in terms of the receiver, the same is true with punishers. Punishers must be defined in terms of the receiver, not the giver. Okay, so thank you for sharing, Mr. Gray. You. Okay, let's talk about motivating operations. So we've talked about motivating operations, and we've talked about establishing and abolishing operations before. But remember that motivating operations in general do something in advance that will make the punisher more effective. We're really talking about the use of establishing operations to make punishers more effective. And, for example, giving someone a taste of the punisher in advance. Once you've experienced the punisher, you don't want to experience it again. Announcing that the punisher or the punishment will be public, and announcing that in advance can give a heads up or a warning and make that punishment more aversive, and this usually will increase the likelihood of escape or avoidance, and then you don't have to use the punisher at all. So here's an example of a motivating operation. There are communities across the country where local judges use public shaming as punishment for example, stealing. So this woman has to stand out in front of Walmart for a certain amount of time over so many days with this sign that she carries around with her. When you establish this as your policy, and it's a public policy, it can be a good deterrent. And so motivating operations like knowing that this is what your part of your punishment will be, and seeing other people doing it, can function to increase escape and avoidance instead of engaging in the behavior that leads to this punishment. So I think it depends. You have to be very careful who you use this with. Using it on children or on minors or people with disabilities can be problematic, but for typically developing adults who engage in inappropriate behaviors like stealing from Walmart, this might actually be a very effective deterrent because of its motivating operation abilities. Immediacy. We talked about immediacy in class when we talked about reinforcement. Well, delaying a punisher can devalue its worth as well. Delays can make it difficult for the individual to connect the problem behavior with the punishing consequence, especially when you're dealing with people with disabilities, small children, pets, animals. And as a result, it can make punishment ineffective. And when the individual can't figure out what behavior is causing the punishment, then it will make it difficult for the punishment to effectively suppress that behavior. With normal, functioning, typical, verbal adult humans, you can often use language to bridge that delay. But you have to be careful because the signal that someone has misbehaved and you deliver the information that a punisher is coming, the person who delivers that signal could become a conditioned punisher, and the individual may start to avoid them, or they'll start to change their behavior to avoid the person delivering the message rather than the punishment itself. So it really is best if you use language with this population to set the rules in advance and then not delay the punisher so that they're able to make those connections. It just simply works better. So we've talked about this in class. You know, when we look at delayed punishment, the time that it takes to go from here, the theft, the pickpocketing, to getting caught, to the judge, to the sentencing, to jail time is really delayed. And so what exactly do we punish? Maybe we're punishing getting caught rather than doing the crime. And what are the odds of getting caught? If the odds are only 1 out of 10 or 1 out of 20 times, then maybe the risk is worth it. And because you get to keep whatever you successfully steal, and so behavior doesn't really go down because of punishment, especially when the punishment is that delayed. So you can see why our criminal justice system gets into problems when it wants to dole out punishment for certain crimes, because there are so many rules associated with punishment dealing with things like immediacy and contingency that when you violate so many of them, you delay them, you maybe deliver it non-contingently, it's not severe enough. When you have all of these violations of the rules of punishment, you end up not actually suppressing the behavior. So we have to be careful with that. Contingency, I just mentioned that. Punishment has to be contingent on the target behavior. In other words, the target behavior has to have occurred in order to make the connection between the behavior and the punishment. Punishment in the absence of the target behavior is just mean. We might even call it abuse. We've all been in situations where we've been punished for something that we didn't do. And it's very frustrating. And so punishment in the absence of the target behavior occurs frequently in certain groups. So things like jealous or suspicious spouses who penalize their partners for things that they haven't done. Untrusting parents who don't trust their children, who accuse them of doing things and punish them for doing things that they actually haven't done. And even in the workplace, you can have micromanaging bosses that are constantly snooping around trying to catch you doing something that you're not doing, and it feels like punishment. So it seems as though most therapists would say, well, the behavior has to occur and then you deliver the punisher. But the truth is, in the real world, we deliver punishers all the time for suspicions, not evidence, and that can run into problems. So here are there's a suspicious parents and bosses and partners, and just an example. Okay. Using continuous punishment rather than intermittent punishment. This is really important because you have to remember that intermittent punishment is virtually the same as intermittent reinforcement. In other words, if you only are punished 1 out of 5 times, then 4 out of 5 times you're getting away with the behavior and earning the reinforcers that go along with that misbehavior. So as a result, intermittent reinforcement makes behavior stronger, not weaker. And so if intermittent punishment is functionally the same as intermittent reinforcement, then what we're really doing when we punish behavior is to make the behavior stronger, not weaker. Not getting caught actually leads to greater response strength rather than weaker response strength. And so we run into problems. So that's why we say that punishment has to happen every time that the behavior occurs. And that's very difficult to do when you're the delivery agent. When you are the managing intervention specialist, it's hard to be there every single time that your client engages in the behavior. So that's difficult. So the magnitude is also something that we have to look at. The size of the punisher matters. So if it's too big, it could actually be abuse. If it's too aversive or too strong, it can be abusive. If it's too small, your client or the individual will habituate very quickly, and it won't work for very long. If it works at all, it won't work for very long. It really needs to be large enough to suppress the behavior the very first time. So parents who threaten but don't follow through until they're really angry, that's kind of a problem because their expression, this is really more an expression of their anger. It's not really, oops, there's a typo here. It's not really a behavioral intervention, so to speak. Oops, sorry. It's not really a behavioral intervention. It really has more to do with them expressing their frustration or their anger. We see this in lots of places where punishment is either withheld and withheld and withheld until the individual becomes, until the parent or the teacher becomes so angry that they explode, and then the punisher is way out of proportion and much bigger than it would need to be, had it been doled out at a reasonable level much sooner. Some examples of this are things like 1, 2, 3 magic. I don't know if you guys remember this from when you were kids or if you have nieces and nephews, but parents will count as a warning that a punisher is coming. So they'll say, you know, Tommy, put down that sharp knife, or I'm going to count to 3. And then they start to count. 1, and nothing happens. 2, and nothing happens. They'll even do 2.5, and nothing happens. And it isn't until you get to 3 that the parents actually step in and engage in some level of punishment. And what the children learn is that they can get away with any activity until they get caught, and then they get 1 and 2 and 2.5 and 2 3/4 before they actually have to stop. So that's a problem. It's kind of like our 3 strikes law. Places that have a 3 strikes law say, you know, if you get convicted of a felony 3 times, or 3 crimes, misdemeanors or felonies, then you go to prison. And so what you do is you withhold the big giant punisher. You allow them to get away with it with crimes once and then twice. And then even the smallest infraction on the 3rd time is sufficient to send you to prison. So things are way out of whack. By the time you go to prison for your 3rd, I mean, what if your 3rd thing is breaking a window? And they say, well, now you're going to prison. But before, you've robbed houses, or you've been speeding, or, I mean, you might have done a lot of things. And so these examples of postponing, one way to decrease the magnitude of a punisher is to postpone it, and not deliver it immediately and insufficient, with sufficient force. And so that can also lead to problems of it being less effective. So here's that sort of 3 strikes and you're out. And I don't know if you can see this here, but I guess there's 3 people here, and 2 of them are there for vandalism and indecent exposure. I think that's what this guy is in for. This little kid on the end is a litter bug, but it's his 3rd strike. So things get kind of out of proportion. So let's talk a little bit about some of the side effects of punishment. I just have a couple. I have 1 slide that I want to go over. So when we decide that we're going to use punishment, when we say this behavior is concerning enough that I am going to use punishment to suppress it so that I can then teach appropriate behaviors. Okay, so one of the things about punishment is often it will suppress all spontaneous behavior. So all playful behavior, especially in the presence of the punishing agent. So the parent or the teacher, kids becomes very self-monitoring and very aware that the person who delivers punishment is present, and so they suppress a lot of their behavior. So they become less spontaneous, they become less playful, and that can be a problem. It can also lead to avoidance of the punishing agent. And as a parent, I can tell you that I did not have children so that I could spend my time alienating them by using punishment excessively. But that's what can happen for parents who use excessive punishment. It can lead to avoidance of that individual. It can harm the relationship between you and that parent. So the parent and the child, the relationship suffers when punishment is one of the things that we do. Punishment can start out small and then escalate and ultimately lead to abuse. A lot of abusers are always surprised that what they're doing is abuse, because what they were doing last week and last month and 6 months ago wasn't considered abusive. It grows so gradually and so slowly that they really don't have a measure of when they cross that line from simple punishment to abuse. It's also the case that recipients of punishment tend to habituate, there's another typo, I'll fix that too. They tend to habituate if it's used too often. And so I was talking to one of my students who's in the military, and the military uses a lot of yelling and a lot of aversive interpersonal interactions, as well as exercise punishers. And so, but the problem is that soldiers over the long haul tend to habituate to the yelling, and they, as they do more and more sit-ups and more push-ups for punishment, they also are improving their physical fitness. And so I think the military knows this, and I think they're doing it deliberately to get people stronger and to make them thicker-skinned to things like yelling and people getting right in your face. So that if you ever get captured, you'll be a little bit more resilient. But they're using our tendency to habituate to punishment, and when we use it in the real world and we use punishment too frequently, people tend to habituate, and when that happens, you have to use stronger and stronger punishments in order for it to really be aversive. So to achieve the same effect, you have to use a stronger and stronger levels of punishment. Therefore, it's very easy to escalate to abuse. And if punishment is used inconsistently, it can become intermittent reinforcement. And that can make the problem behavior actually more resistant to an intervention than it would be if you used an appropriate punishment immediately and consistently. So these are just a few of the effects of punishment. And if you look at just this short list of problems that come about as a result of the use of punishment, it becomes pretty obvious quickly that over-reliance on punishment is going to lead you into a lot of these side effects. It's also the list of things we talked about to make punishment effective. It's very easy to violate those, making punishment therefore ineffective. So when I say that punishment should be your last resort, your last intervention of choice, most of the time, the primary reason for doing that, in my opinion, is because it's really hard to do punishment effectively. Because there's so many rules and so many side effects. And between the risk of getting it wrong and not having your punishment work very effectively, and the side effects that can come as a result, makes punishment my last choice. I don't really want to use it because it can be ineffective and have side effects that I really don't want. Maybe I can get the child to stop using foul language, but I also could suppress a lot of behaviors. I may get avoidance of the individual. There may be suppression in spontaneous and playful behavior, and I don't think I want all those side effects. So, and then of course, the final straw is that punishment only teaches you what you did wrong. It never teaches you what you should do instead. So unless your parent, teacher, intervention specialist, therapist, whoever it is, has a reinforcement plan for appropriate alternative behaviors in the wings ready to go, punishment alone isn't going to teach you what you should do instead. Okay, so that's it for chapter 6. I think I'll end there, and we're going to pick up with I believe it's chapter 17. So have a good day.